Hello guys, this is CannibalChess, and in this video we're going to be learning about the King's Gambit. So we're going to be looking at some of the main lines you can get into when playing the King's Gambit from White's perspective. And although Bobby Fischer didn't really care for the King's Gambit, and he kind of thought it was a definite win for Black basically, he did actually lose against it. I know of one specific time that he did it in 1960 against Boris Spassky, so there are definitely things that White can do to equalize and even gain an advantage and win the game. So we're just going to be looking at how to make it to that point and take advantage of Black's weaknesses. So starting off with the first line we're going to look at, e4, e5, f4, and then pawn takes on f4. And then here from this position you have a lot of different options as White. You could play something like knight f3, you could play bishop c4, you could even play queen to f3. So let's look at this bishop to c4 idea. Now this isn't, I wouldn't consider this the best option for White, but it definitely is an option. But the problem with this move is that it doesn't control this diagonal that the queen is hitting, and so the queen can just come down here to h4, and then now you can't play anything like g3, because if you play g3 you're just going to get pawn captures, and then you're going to be down quite a bit after pawn takes or pawn moves here. It's a very, very terrible position for White. So you'd have to move the king maybe to f1 is probably the best move here, and then now you can't castle, and your king side is very weak. So Black would probably play something like knight f6, trying to get more pieces, attacking your king side, and also hitting the pawn on e4. As White here, there are a few moves you could play. You could definitely play knight f3 would be a good move, kicking the queen away. So the queen would go back maybe to h6, and then you could play d4. You could play knight c3. You could maybe play e5 as well. If you play d4 here, it looks like you're hanging the pawn on e4, but you're actually not. So if your opponent tries to take, then it's actually better for White after queen to e2, or e1 works as well, because you're pinning the knight to the king. And if they try to defend the knight with something like f5, then you can just play knight to c3, and you're attacking the knight twice. So they don't really have any way of defending the knight again that's going to help too much. So if they try and get their pieces out, or if they try and push the pawn, let's say they played bishop to d6, then you can just take the knight on e4, and then once they retake, then you're just going to be able to pick up the pawn, and your position as White is going to be better here. Now going into the next line, this is the one that I would say is probably better for White to play. So here you can play knight to f3 as White, and this is guarding the h4 square, so there's no ideas of the queen coming and checking the king at that point. So Black might play something like g5 here, just trying to make a little pawn chain and push more on the king side to try and get it a little bit weaker. White can play bishop c4 now, and White's now getting quite a few attacks going on the king side of Black as well. So this is kind of the trade-off for White here. They gambit a pawn, and then they get their pieces quite active pretty fast. And here Black might continue with something like pawn to g4, so just trying to kick the knight off of this square, so then they could have ideas of playing this move. And here, one of the most popular moves for White is actually to just ignore it and simply castle. And so Black takes, and then here White takes with the queen on f3. And so now you kind of have this little battery going with the rook and the queen, and you're attacking this pawn twice now. But this battery is also semi-attacking this pawn. So if this file gets a little bit more open, if this pawn is able to get taken later, then you're going to be hitting this pawn really hard with the bishop, the queen, and the rook. So Black has to be very careful here, and Black could play e7, or they could play f6, and both are kind of doing the same thing. They're getting the queen here or here to guard this pawn, or also guard this pawn, depending on which one you do. If you play f6, you're going to guard this pawn and also guard this one. So I would just say I would play f6, just because it seems a little better to guard the pawn on f4 as well. So if the queen ends up taking, you can just trade down material and there's less of threats. And here is the last line that we're going to touch on real quick. So what happens if black, instead of taking the pawn, just goes d5 instead? And this might look a little scary. You don't really know what to do. The best move, I would say, for white here is to just take the pawn on d5. And definitely don't get confused. If you take the pawn on e5 instead by accident, then black has a huge advantage. They play queen h4, and then you kind of have to play g3 here, and then they take the pawn on e4. You have to block, so block with the knight, bishop, queen. It doesn't really matter. After you block, they're just going to get the rook on h1, and they're going to be up an entire rook. So definitely don't take the pawn on e5. Take the pawn on d5 instead. And here, if your opponent tries to take the pawn on d5 with the queen, then white is actually better. After you play knight c3, so you gain kind of a tempo, get a piece out, you also attack black's queen, so even if the queen goes back here to try and get a possible attack on the king, you can just take the pawn and you're still better. So after queen takes back, then you can play bishop to e2, and then more of your pieces are developed. The queen's kind of out in the middle of the board. After you play something like d4, you're going to get it kicked away. You could even play f3 next move if they don't move the queen back. So you're going to have quite a big advantage going out of the opening. But what happens if they don't take the pawn on d5 and actually just play the best idea for black, which would just be e takes f4? Well, then as a white, you can just play knight to f3, and it's basically kind of the same thing. You're guarding the h4 square. You don't really have to worry about guarding this pawn too much. There's really nothing you can do to protect it. You could play c4 possibly, and then at that point, it would just kind of become a regular looking game. So after your opponent plays in something like knight f6, you could play c4, and then you're just fighting for the center like normal. You'll probably get your knight out, and then maybe your bishop here, castle, maybe push d3 at some point, trying to attack this pawn. So it will kind of just turn into a regular game at that point. You could also play bishop to e2 immediately, and then just let your opponent take. Possibly would work. So those are just the main ideas if they decide not to take on f4 immediately. And so yeah, that was my quick introduction into the King's Gambit opening. I hope y'all found this video helpful or just enjoyed it in general. And if you did, please consider subscribing to the channel. And thanks for watching.